The issue runs even deeper than just the gendering of games and gamers. We also have to deal with the troubling implications of objectivity itself. Objectivity is a very nebulous term and it can be used in many ways, but over time I've become really sickened by the term in general. To call something objective is not inherently bad, but in its application it can become way too problematic. It starts with what I believe to be a very fundamental misunderstanding of how objectivity operates.
True, pure, uninhibited objectivity does not and cannot exist. The faultiness of human perception and how language and social norms complicate that perception means that we cannot ever have a fact or truth that is unconditional. We can have axioms which are unconditional in the sense that they are self-affirming, such as the law of identity, which are logic statements that are true regardless of perception, but facts of observation can never be truly devoid of fault in human perception. As such, there is no absolute objectivity, but instead degrees of objectivity. In this sense, objectivity can be seen as sort of a measurement, where something can be more objective or less objective, but nothing can ever be absolutely objective. For example, it would be entirely subjective of me to say that Shadow of the Colossus is the greatest game of all time. It would be more objective to say that the game was well received, but a point of contention could be well received by who. It would be even more objective to say that the game was well received by Eurogamer, who gave the game a 10 out of 10 review score. Still, a point of contention could be made. Why does it matter what Eurogamer thinks? And this is where we start to see how relevant subjectivity is, even in discussions that we believe to be objective. It's ultimately our own opinions that assign value to objective measurements, which prevents them from being absolutely objective, such that the objective ultimately becomes subjective. There is no reason why you need to care what Eurogamer thinks about Shadow of the Colossus. Using that as an example, an objective, measurable frame of reference for how Shadow of the Colossus has been received critically does nothing to validate my initial statement that Shadow of the Colossus is the greatest game of all time. Because to make the jump from well-received to greatest is to elect well-received as though that is the only measurement through which a game can be considered greatest. Ultimately, no matter what argument you use to support your perspective on games, the counterpoint is always going to be, I don't care. This exact argument will likely be used against me by commentators responding to this video, that I could be right about anything or everything, but it doesn't matter. Pointing back to that comment I quoted earlier, a likely counterargument to everything I'm saying is that even if I can demonstrate that gaming is male-dominated, it doesn't matter because men and women both like it better that way. Of course, my survey suggests otherwise, but this gets to why objectivity is so difficult to discuss. Because objective measurements are used to justify beliefs and opinions, which then creates an imbalance for what objective measurements have the most worth. In part 5, I discussed how gamers try to argue that certain games simply aren't games. Their argument is usually to point to some sort of objective measurement that you can use to identify a game as a game, and then say that games that don't meet this objective measurement don't qualify. Of course, they use measurements that happen to correlate heavily with genres that do well with men, and contrasts heavily with genres that do well with women. It's hard to ignore that the so-called objective standards that people use to determine which games are games lends itself well to male dominance by presenting barriers to entry for women into the social space by differentiating games that we play as not games to begin with. What's a bit harder to realize, however, is that the objective standards for what makes a good game versus a bad game can repeat this same issue. I've always contested arguments of objectivity with regards to the worth of games. I know that I'm likely in the minority on this. Even on my survey, 58% of the people said that some games are just objectively better than others, while 42% argued otherwise. Respondents who argued no had similar arguments that I would argue, such as one person who said that emotional experiences are different for everyone. Respondents who said yes, however, consistently argued for objective measurements that are still subjectively defined, such as better graphics or better controls. These things are up to each individual player to decide, so it's ultimately not objective. Someone said, for example, interesting vision, and how we interpret the vision of a game is subjective in terms of what we think that vision is, and in how interesting we find it. There is no such thing as objectively interesting, because interesting refers to a personal standpoint with regards to something. Absolutely any objective criteria you can come up with for why a game is objectively better than another is one that ultimately is going to be susceptible to counter arguments. For example, if someone were to say that a game needs to control well, then what does that say about art games that deliberately control poorly for an aesthetic or thematic purpose, such as In a Single Breath, a game that is deliberately disorienting mechanically? It doesn't control well in a traditional sense, but it does what it set out to do. What does that also say about Silent Hill, a game that, for many, controls poorly because of outdated controls, while for others, they believe it enhances the horror aspects of the experience? Meanwhile, people can argue that a game is objectively worse if it doesn't do what it set out to do, but a counterpoint can be made about how player interaction with the game can fundamentally change the nature of the game, such that it no longer can ever do what it set out to. Most speedrunners who speedrun Quake would probably say that they love the game, but yet it failed massively in accounting for glitches. That failure on id's part subsequently led to the development of speedrunning itself, in particular the use of the bunny hop, a glitch that turned into an exploit that was never part of the creator's original intentions, but became a welcome emergent function of the game for players nonetheless. Is Quake objectively worse because of an unintended feature that an entire community was able to spawn from? To argue that, you'd have to dismiss the value of the subjective experience as being less important than the objective measurement that you use to qualify what is pretty much exclusively a subjective experience: the worth of a game.
The worth of a game being defined on those objective terms always goes back to some sort of developmental feature or some sort of critical reception. But this is all treated as though it exists in a vacuum, when of course it doesn't. Most gamers are still men, and most developers are still men. We still belong to a culture largely by men and for men. So when we try to measure the value of the work involved and the reception that results, we're measuring the worth of games on the values of men. The values of men go into how games are made, and they go into how games are perceived, because men are both the market and the sellers. This means that when we try to discuss games on objective terms, divorcing the games themselves from the culture that shapes both their intention and their reception, we ignore the gendered issues on how games are evaluated.
Those very same objective terms coincide very well with masculinized norms. To say that it is objectively better to have better graphics is nonsense, because we as individuals define what we mean by better graphics. If you try to place an objective measurement, such as polycount or engine or fidelity, you run into a problem. Because gaming is made mostly by men and mostly for men, the games that have the highest polycount, engine, and fidelity will often be AAA games, and will often be games in the genres that do well with men, such as shooters, action games, racing games, and sports games. In fact, whenever new consoles come out, racing games are some of the first to be produced for the console as a means of showcasing the technology. Most of the budget for graphics, engine, and fidelity are likely going to go towards these games because they have the most sway in the reception of games and consequently, the sales. As such, we're much less likely to find games with objectively higher fidelity or more advanced engine specs from the likes of an atmospheric exploration game or a family/farm sim game. I mean, how do you even compare the graphics between a game like Grand Theft Auto 5 and a game like Lumines on the PSP, a game that my mom would play for hours? You can compare them on subjective standards, such as which one you prefer, or which one is nicer to look at, or which one you feel does the best job at what it set out to do, or you can use an objective measurement, like polycount or engine, at which point they are technically comparable in terms of digits, but it's a meaningless comparison, and to then assign a value based on that very same measurement means that, by default, Grand Theft Auto 5 will win.
Are objective measurements bad? In and of themselves, no. And there's certainly a lot of values to objective measurement. The problem is when we try to come up with objective measurements of value. To do so requires ignoring the culture surrounding how we frame these measurements, and helps to influence perception within gaming towards favoring standards that stem from a masculinized gaming and social environment. So-called objective standards do not exist in a vacuum. The bigger overarching standards are themselves a result of our cultural values, and those cultural values are not in any way objective. When we frame our conversations on terms that deprive conversations about games from the culture that both influences their creation and their perception, we end up with a situation where the games that are considered objectively better are almost always going to be games that continue to put masculine perspectives in a position of privilege.
To undo this, I feel like we need to embrace subjectivity as a worthwhile endeavor, rather than trying to force games we admire to fit an objective standard. Games have nearly limitless possibilities, but the constraints on how we perceive games is filtered through the male-dominated culture that surrounds us, which helps lend credence to the idea that stagnation is the best option. The platonic ideal of a game, as determined by gamers, would be a game that has no bugs, has the most advanced graphical fidelity imaginable, is well received by all of the critics and audiences alike, and did absolutely everything it set out to do. Is this a bad ideal? Not necessarily, but it's an ideal that can't be removed from its context. Think about who exactly the critics and audiences are. Think about what games have the most advanced graphical fidelity and the most attention to fixing bugs. These aren't going to be games like Proteus. They're going to be games like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. If we construct our platonic ideal of games on such standards, we continue to validate the demand that gaming be by men and for men, because these objective measurements are ultimately meaningless without that context. And with that context became a justification for the status quo of how games are made and who they're made for.
We need to recognize the value of subjective perspectives. This whole reals before feels thing is not only a common thing in gaming culture, but in culture at large. Men are stereotyped as more logical and women as more emotional, and this is a huge false dichotomy. Emotions don't override logic, and men can be just as emotional as women, while women can be just as logical as men. Subjectivity is denigrated and objectivity valued, but as I've said, objectivity kind of doesn't exist. So really, we're weighing some subjective standards as being more valuable than others by trying to appeal to logic, when really it's nothing more than feelings. But feelings are okay. Feelings are a good thing when they're recognized properly and managed. How a game makes you feel, what it provokes you to think about, these things have worth, and that worth is hampered by trying to demote them to a lesser status over supposedly objective standards like graphical fidelity that ultimately don't mean anything. But yet, there's still even more lying underneath the issues of gaming culture and how it can affect our perception. In part 7, I'll discuss how games specifically can change our perception.